On the morning of February 24, 1991, the largest coalition assembled since the Second World War crossed into Iraqi-occupied Kuwait and southern Iraq on a front stretching over 300 kilometers. More than 700,000 coalition troops, soldiers from 34 nations. The most meticulously planned ground offensive in the history of the United States military. 7 months earlier, on August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein had sent 100,000 Iraqi troops and 700 tanks across the Kuwaiti border in the middle of the night. The Kuwaiti military numbered roughly 16,000 men. They fought with everything they had. They were overrun in hours. The emir fled. The country fell. Iraqi troops immediately began a campaign of looting, torture, and systematic atrocity against the Kuwaiti population that the United Nations would later document in exhaustive detail summary executions. Hospital patients pulled from life support. A maternity ward ransacked. Thousands of Kuwaiti civilians detained and never seen again. Kuwait had been a sovereign nation for 29 years. It ceased to exist on August 2, 1990, and Saddam Hussein announced it was now the 19th province of Iraq. The world said no. And for the first time since the founding of the United Nations, the international community assembled a military coalition with a clear mandate and the will and the means to enforce it. What General Norman Schwarzkopf and his coalition commanders designed in response was one of the most brilliant operational plans in American military history. Not a frontal assault into the teeth of Iraqi defenses along the Kuwaiti coast, where Saddam expected the attack to come, and where 500,000 Iraqi troops waited behind minefields and fortifications and oil-flooded trenches. A feint. A deception. And then a left hook so far to the west, sweeping so deep into Iraqi territory, that by the time Saddam understood what was happening, his army was already encircled and his supply lines were already cut. The deception campaign that preceded the ground war was a masterpiece of military misdirection. For weeks before the assault, U.S. Marines conducted amphibious exercises in the Persian Gulf within sight of the Kuwaiti coastline, convincing the Iraqi High Command that the main attack would come from the sea. Saddam kept 6 divisions in reserve along the coast waiting for a Marine landing that never came. CIA and military deception operations fed false intelligence to Iraqi commanders suggesting the coalition was preparing a massive frontal assault directly into Kuwait from Saudi Arabia. Iraqi engineers spent weeks reinforcing exactly the positions the coalition had no intention of attacking. Meanwhile, in the weeks before the ground assault, Schwarzkopf secretly moved 7 divisions, including the entire VII Corps, the most powerful armored force assembled since World War II, hundreds of kilometers to the west, positioning them for the sweeping left hook that would become known as the Hail Mary. Moving that many troops and that much equipment in secret across open desert, without Iraqi reconnaissance detecting it, was a logistical achievement that military historians still study. Over 250,000 soldiers, 60,000 vehicles, and 7 million tons of fuel, ammunition, and supplies repositioned in darkness and silence. When the ground war began at 4:00 a.m. on February 24th, the Iraqis were looking in the wrong direction. The Marine divisions hit the Iraqi lines in Kuwait directly, breaching the minefields and obstacles faster than anyone had predicted. Iraqi resistance, already broken by 38 days of the most intensive air campaign in history, collapsed far more quickly than the most optimistic coalition projections. Arab coalition forces, Saudi, Egyptian, Syrian, Kuwaiti, advanced alongside the Marines, with Kuwaiti soldiers fighting to reclaim their own country alongside their liberators. To the west, VII Corps surged north into Iraq. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, breached the Iraqi defensive line and opened the lanes for the armored divisions behind them. The 1st Armored Division and 3rd Armored Division poured through and turned east, driving toward the Republican Guard formations that were Saddam's strategic reserve and his last hope of stopping the coalition advance. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment raced ahead as the reconnaissance screen, finding the enemy and fixing them for the heavy brigades behind, leading directly to the Battle of 73 Easting on February 26, where Eagle Troop shattered the Tawakalna Division in 23 minutes. XVII Airborne Corps, further to the west, drove even deeper into Iraq with the 24th Infantry Division and the 101st Airborne, cutting Highway 8 along the Euphrates River Valley, the main Iraqi supply and withdrawal route north, and sealing the trap. The 101st conducted the largest air assault in history, inserting thousands of soldiers by helicopter deep into Iraqi territory to block any Republican Guard escape north. By February 26th, less than 48 hours into the ground war, Kuwait City was effectively liberated. Kuwaiti resistance fighters who had spent 7 months hiding, fighting, and dying for their country raised their flag over the city. Coalition forces were at the gates. On February 27th, President Bush declared the liberation of Kuwait. The ceasefire took effect at 8:00 a.m. on February 28th, exactly 100 hours after the ground war began. I want to tell you what 100 hours actually means in human terms, because the speed of that victory can make it seem abstract. On August 2, 1990, a Kuwaiti soldier named Salem Barak al-Sharari was at his post when the Iraqi tanks crossed the border. He fought until his unit was overwhelmed, then went underground, joining the Kuwaiti resistance. He spent 7 months moving safe house to safe house, passing intelligence to coalition forces, watching his country occupied and his people terrorized. On February 26, 1991, he was part of the Kuwaiti forces that entered Kuwait City with the coalition. He was one of the first Kuwaiti soldiers to raise the flag. That story multiplied across thousands of Kuwaiti soldiers and civilians who endured 7 months of occupation and came out the other side into liberation, is what Desert Storm was for. The numbers of the ground campaign are staggering in their one-sidedness. The coalition suffered 240 killed in action across all 34 nations in the entire ground war. American combat deaths in the ground campaign, 147, against an Iraqi military of over 500,000 in theater. Against the 4th largest army in the world, with a decade of combat experience from the Iran-Iraq War, dug into prepared defensive positions they had spent months fortifying. Iraqi military losses in the ground campaign are estimated at between 20,000 and 35,000 killed, with an additional 75,000 to 80,000 taken prisoner. Entire Iraqi divisions surrendered, intact soldiers walking toward coalition lines with their hands up, surrendering to American reconnaissance aircraft, surrendering to news camera crews, surrendering to anyone who looked like they were not going to shoot them, because the war was over and they knew it, and they had known it for days. General Schwarzkopf stood before the press on February 27 and presented one of the most comprehensive battlefield briefings in the history of military public affairs. He showed the maps. He showed the movements. He showed the trap that had closed around the Iraqi army. He called it, with characteristic bluntness, a rather dramatic situation. The reporters laughed. He had earned the laugh. The liberation of Kuwait was not just a military victory. It was a validation of what the post-Vietnam American military had become. The all-volunteer force, the reformed doctrine, the investment in training and technology, the moral clarity of a mission that was unambiguously right. A sovereign nation invaded, its people brutalized, the world demanding it be made right. For once everything aligned. The cause was just, the planning was brilliant, the soldiers were ready, the coalition held together, and a nation that had ceased to exist on August 2, 1990, raised its flag again on February 26, 1991. 100 hours, one sovereign nation restored, the American military at the absolute peak of what it could do and what it stood for. That is worth remembering, because moments like that do not come along very often, and the men and women who made it happen deserve to have it told with the full weight it deserves.